Hello there, my weary twilight souls. Tonight, we follow the story of Leah Clearwater, the only female wolf in Quileute history, and one of the most quietly compelling figures in the entire Twilight saga. Hers is a story of loss and fury, an unexpected grace, of becoming something no woman had ever been before, and slowly, painfully, learning to live inside that truth. If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. Alright, now let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Breathe in slowly. And let the story of Leah Clearwater carry you into the quiet, wild heart of a world where the forest never sleeps, and neither does she. The La Push Reservation sits at the edge of the world, or at least it feels that way. The Pacific Ocean presses against its shores with a kind of ancient insistence. The waves neither gentle nor cruel, but simply constant, reminding everyone who lives within earshot that something enormous and indifferent exists just beyond the tree line. The forest rises dark and dense behind the modest houses, cedar and spruce and fir growing so thick that the light filtering through them arrives pale and green and softened, like light through water. It is a place that shapes the people who grow up inside it, that gives them a particular relationship with wildness and with permanence, with the sense that the world is both larger and more intimate than it appears from the outside. The fog that rolls in off the ocean in the early mornings does not lift so much as it simply relocates, moving inland through the trees, settling into the spaces between things. Even in summer, the air carries a coolness that feels lived in, ancient, like the land itself is exhaling something it has been holding for a very long time. Leah Clearwater grew up knowing exactly where she belonged. She was the daughter of Harry Clearwater, a man whose presence on the reservation carried the particular warmth of someone deeply rooted in his community. Harry was the kind of man who showed up, who brought food when someone was grieving, who laughed easily and meant it, who sat with people through difficult things without trying to resolve what could not be resolved. His opinion was sought because it was reliably given with both honesty and care, never weaponized, never withheld as a form of power. He was a tribal elder in the truest sense of the term, not merely in title, but in the daily practice of it, in the 100 small ways he demonstrated that belonging to a community meant showing up for it consistently, even when it was inconvenient, even when no one would have noticed if he hadn't. Leah absorbed that quality simply by growing up in his proximity. She learned, watching her father move through the world, what it meant to be genuinely present for the people around you. She learned what it looked like to carry responsibility without resentment, to hold a position of trust without letting it harden into authority. Her mother, Sue, was a different kind of strength, Where Harry was warmth and laughter and easy connection, Sue was precision and practicality and a quiet ferocity that Leah would one day recognize in herself, though it would take years and considerable pain before she could look at that recognition without flinching. Sue ran their household with efficient love, the kind that does not always announce itself, but is present in every detail. In the packed lunches and the enforced curfews and the particular look that communicated more than most people's speeches. Sue did not waste words, did not perform emotion for an audience, did not require that the people she loved understand in the moment what she was doing for them. She trusted that eventually they would understand, and she was usually right. Leah grew up between these two gravitational forces and was shaped by both, inheriting her father's deep capacity for loyalty and her mother's refusal to accept less than what she deserved. It was not always a comfortable inheritance. The combination produced someone with very high standards and very little patience for pretense, which was sometimes an asset and sometimes simply an inconvenience. She was sharp as a girl, sharp-tongued when it suited her, sharp-minded always. She was not the most patient person on the reservation, not the most accommodating, not the one who smiled automatically when she was supposed to smile simply because someone expected it of her. There was something in her that resisted performance, that found the gap between what people said and what they meant almost physically uncomfortable. She noticed things. She noticed when someone's words did not match their expression, when kindness was strategic rather than genuine, when a silence was being used to avoid a truth that everyone in the room already knew. This perceptiveness was not always welcome. It made her occasionally difficult to be around for people who preferred not to be seen too clearly. But it also made her fiercely loyal to the people she chose to trust, because her trust, once given, was given with full knowledge of who the person actually was, rather than who they were performing themselves to be. She was never cruel. That distinction mattered, and the people who knew her well understood it. Leah's directness was not cruelty. It was simply the absence of the particular social softening that most people apply as a matter of course, the automatic cushioning of honesty that makes it easier to receive but also, inevitably, less true. Leah had not yet had reason to question whether this quality required adjustment. She was still, in these years, someone whose foundation had never given way, and people whose foundations have never given way do not yet know what they are made of. She had Seth, her younger brother, who had arrived in her life with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone born to be liked. Seth was easy in the way Leah was not, easy with people and with the world and with himself, possessed of a natural warmth that drew others to him without effort or intention. He was the kind of person who made you feel immediately comfortable, who somehow communicated in the first 30 seconds of meeting him that he thought well of you and was genuinely glad you existed. Leah loved him with the particular fierceness of an older sister who has watched a younger sibling navigate the world and has spent years resisting the urge to make that navigation easier than it ought to be. She was proud of him. She was also, on some level, she would never have articulated out loud, grateful for him, because Seth's presence in the family created a particular kind of balance, a counterweight to Leah's sharper edges that meant the household never tipped too far into tension. And then there was Sam Yulee. She had known Sam for years before she understood what he would become to her. He was older, part of the older generation of Lapush teenagers, present at the edges of her awareness the way familiar things are before they suddenly become essential. He was simply there, in the way that certain people are simply there throughout your formative years, present at gatherings and community events and the ordinary crossings of a small reservation life, without yet occupying any particular significance in your interior landscape. Then, gradually, and then all at once, that changed. She became aware of him the way you become aware of a sound you suddenly realize has always been there, except that now you have heard it properly for the first time, and cannot imagine how you missed it before. Sam was not loud. He did not fill a room by announcing himself, did not require an audience for his personality the way some people do. He filled a room simply by being present in it, by the quality of his stillness, by the way he listened as though what you were saying genuinely mattered to him, and he was in no hurry to arrive at his own response. He was steady in a way that felt rare and precious to Leah, who was still in the process of becoming herself, and found his groundedness profoundly compelling. He knew who he was. He knew what he believed. He did not seem to require external confirmation of either of these things, and in the company of someone who had always been slightly too aware of how she was being perceived, that self-sufficiency felt like coming into a warm room after a long time in the cold. She felt, with Sam, like the sharpest and most honest version of herself, was not only acceptable, but wanted. He did not ask her to soften. He did not flinch at her directness or suggest, through subtle pressure, that she might be easier to love if she were easier to be around. He simply looked at her as she was and seemed to find that sufficient, and the effect of that on a person like Leah, who had always been quietly aware that she was considered too much by people who would have preferred slightly less, was profound and lasting. They fell into each other the way things fall when they have been moving toward each other for a long time without quite knowing it. There was a period of friendship that shifted almost imperceptibly into something else, a period of that something else crystallizing into certainty, and then there was simply the fact of them. Sam and Leah, Leah and Sam, a pairing the reservation absorbed without surprise, because it made a particular kind of sense, the sense that seems obvious only in retrospect but feels, to the people inside it, like the most natural thing in the world. She loved him with her whole self. That is the only accurate way to describe it, and it deserves to be said plainly, because anything more qualified would fail to capture what was actually true. Leah was not someone who loved cautiously or partially, who maintained interior reserves against the possibility of loss. When she loved, she did so with the same completeness she brought to everything that genuinely mattered to her. Sam Yuley had come to matter to her more than she had language for. She had stopped trying to quantify it, had simply accepted it as the condition of her life, the way you accept the weather or the tides, as something that simply was, and that organized everything else around itself. She imagined the future with him in it, not in precise pictorial detail, but in the way you imagine air in a room you have not yet entered, not as a specific image, but as a given, as the condition everything else required. She was not naive about that future. She understood that life on the reservation carried its difficulties. Harry's health had begun to introduce a new quality of worry into the household, something everyone was managing carefully, something present in her mother's controlled expressions and her father's occasional breathlessness after exertion that would not have troubled him a few years before. She knew that nothing was guaranteed, but she believed, with the deep, quiet confidence of someone whose foundation had never shifted, that Sam was permanent, that love like this, chosen fully and given completely, endured. She had not yet learned what the world does to certainties. In the months before everything changed, Leah was 19 years old, living at home, working, existing within the warm, familiar rhythms of La Bouche, with the particular contentment of someone who belongs somewhere and knows it. Her father was managing his health with the resigned practicality of a man who had decided not to surrender more ground to worry than was strictly necessary. Seth was growing into himself with the obnoxious vitality of a teenage boy who takes the fundamental goodness of the world entirely for granted, which is exactly how a teenage boy should move through the world, and which Leah found, on her better days, quietly wonderful to witness. It was an ordinary life, and it was, in the way of ordinary lives, quietly beautiful in ways that cannot be recognized from the inside. That kind of beauty is only visible from the outside in retrospect, once the ordinary thing has been taken away and you are standing in the space where it used to be, understanding for the first time what it was worth. She was happy, that is the simple truth, and it deserves to be stated simply, without qualification or irony, because what came after would make it very easy to forget that there was a before. A time when Leah Clearwater was a young woman with a future she believed in completely, with a love she had never thought to question, with a father still living, and a laugh that came easily, and a world that had not yet shown her what it was capable of taking away. She was happy, and the world, as it does, was already preparing to change that. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Sam stopped calling. Not gradually, not with the natural trailing off of someone who was busy or distracted or navigating something he needed space to process. He simply stopped, completely and without warning, the way a light stops when the power goes out. One day he was present, and then he was not, and the absence was so total and so sudden that Leah spent the first several days convinced there had been some mistake, a misunderstanding, something easily explained by a conversation that had not yet happened but would, any moment now. She waited for that conversation. It did not come. The days stretched into a week, and then beyond the week, and the silence continued. Sam did not appear at the places he usually appeared. He did not answer when she came to his door. The people she asked gave her answers that were not quite answers, responses that acknowledged her question without actually addressing it, deflections so practiced they had clearly been prepared in advance. She could feel the shape of what was not being said pressing against the surface of every interaction, enormous and unacknowledged, and the sensation of it was maddening in a way she could not fully articulate, because she had no name yet for what she was experiencing. She was being kept outside of something. That much was clear. The community around her, people she had known her entire life, people who had eaten at her family's table and laughed with her father and watched her and Seth grow up, were collectively withholding something from her. Not with cruelty, or at least not with intended cruelty, but the effect was the same regardless of the intention. She was on the outside of a circle she could feel but could not see, And somewhere inside that circle was the answer to where Sam Yulee had gone and why he had not thought to tell her. She told herself the explanations that were available to her, that he was going through something personal and needed time, that there had been a family crisis he was managing privately, that the distance was temporary, that it would resolve, that she would understand it once he was ready to explain. She built these explanations carefully and deliberately. The way you build something you already suspect will not hold, because the alternative was to sit with the possibility that the silence meant exactly what it felt like it meant, and that possibility was not one she was prepared to hold yet. She missed him with a physicality that surprised her. She had not known, before his absence, how thoroughly he had become part of the texture of her daily life. Not just the significant moments, but the ordinary ones. The particular way he answered his phone. The sound of him in a room before she had registered he was there. The specific quality of ease she felt in his presence. That sensation of being exactly the right version of herself, which she had taken entirely for granted, because it had simply been the condition of her life for so long that she had stopped noticing it. Now that it was gone, she could not stop noticing it. Its absence was everywhere. Weeks passed, and then Sam came back. He did not come back the way she had imagined he would in her better moments, with an explanation that made sense of the silence, with an apology she could hold on to, with the resumption of the familiar warmth she had been waiting for. He came back changed, physically changed in ways that were immediately apparent and deeply unsettling. He was larger, his frame carrying a new mass that had not been there before. His movements possessed of a quality she could not name precisely, but that registered instinctively as different, in a way that went beyond the physical. He looked at the world differently. He held himself differently. The person who had gone away and the person who had returned wore the same face, but something essential had shifted behind it. Something she could feel the absence of even when she could not articulate what it was. She tried. She asked him what had happened, where he had been, why he had disappeared without a word. He told her he couldn't explain. He said it more than once, in more than one conversation, with a consistency that suggested it was not evasion, but something closer to an actual constraint, as though the inability to explain was itself a condition he was living inside rather than a choice he was making. She did not find this comforting. An honest inability to explain is still, from the outside, functionally identical to a choice not to, and the effect on Leah was the same either way. What she could feel, even without explanation, was the wall. Something had been built between them in the weeks of his absence, and it had not come down with his return. He was present in front of her, and simultaneously somewhere she could not reach, looking at her with eyes that held what she slowly came to recognize as guilt. Not the guilt of someone who had done something wrong in a simple sense, but the guilt of someone who was carrying knowledge that caused them pain, knowledge that had consequences for someone they cared about and that they were not permitted to share. She stayed. She tried to find her way back to him through the wall. She told herself that whatever had happened to him was something he would eventually be able to tell her, that patience was what was required, that love meant remaining present even when presence was difficult. She believed this genuinely for a while. She held onto it the way you hold onto the side of something solid when the ground beneath you is uncertain. And then Emily came. Emily Young was Leah's cousin. They had grown up in proximity to each other, had shared the particular intimacy of family that exists independent of chosen closeness. The intimacy of people who know each other's histories because those histories overlap, rather than because they have deliberately sought each other out. Emily was warm and beautiful and genuinely kind, possessed of the kind of effortless likability that Leah had always observed from a slight distance, not with envy exactly, but with the awareness of contrast that comes from being someone less immediately easy to love. Emily arrived on the reservation for a visit. That was ordinary enough. Family visited. Cousins came and went. Leah had no reason to assign particular significance to her presence, no framework yet for understanding what was about to happen. She learned about it the way you learn about the things that destroy you. Not all at once, not in a single conversation that contained the full truth in legible form, but gradually, through accumulation. Through the way Sam's attention oriented toward Emily with an immediacy that bypassed conscious choice. Through the way he looked at her, a look that Leah recognized from the inside because she had been on the receiving end of it, and now, without warning, she was not. Through the way the air in any room that contained both of them seemed to reorganize itself around that fact, she understood before anyone told her. The understanding arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. A cold settling into her chest. There was nothing like grief, and nothing like anger, and nothing like any emotion she had a name for, because she had never experienced anything like this before, and her emotional vocabulary did not yet contain the words for what was happening to her. Sam had imprinted on Emily. She would learn the word for it later. She would learn the mechanics of it, the Quileute tradition that described it, the understanding within the tribe that imprinting was not a choice but a compulsion, not preference, but something closer to gravity. The wolf sees, and something in him simply reorients, permanently and without appeal, toward the person he is imprinted on. It is not something that can be undone or argued with or waited out. It is not something Sam had sought or wanted or could have prevented. By every framework available to describe it, he was not responsible for what had happened. Leah knew this. Eventually she would know it clearly and completely. But knowing a thing intellectually and being released from its consequences are not the same thing. And the knowledge that Sam had not chosen this did not change what it meant. He had not left her for someone better. He had not left her because she was insufficient, or because his feelings had changed, or because something between them had broken down. He had left her for something that existed entirely outside the realm of choice, something she could not compete with because competition was not the right category for what had happened. She had been replaced not by a rival, but by a force of nature. She could not argue against it. She could not improve herself into relevance. She could not find the fault in herself that had caused this, could not locate the thing she should have done differently, because there was no such thing. The universe had simply reached into her life and rearranged it without asking her permission. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from loss you cannot assign to anyone. Grief that has no object, no responsible party, no one against whom anger can justifiably be directed. It is in some ways the most difficult kind, because anger is useful. Anger gives you something to do with the pain, somewhere to put it, a direction to move in. Without a target, grief simply sits inside you, heavy and structureless, taking up the space where something else used to be. Leah would find her anger eventually. She would find it in abundance, and it would be misread and mischaracterized and used as evidence of a bitterness that was really just grief without anywhere to go. But in those first weeks, before the anger arrived to make the pain manageable, there was only the raw and wordless fact of what she had lost, and the terrible clarity of understanding that it was not coming back. She had to watch. That was the thing no one seemed to fully understand. The detail that transformed ordinary heartbreak into something closer to sustained cruelty, even if the cruelty was unintentional. She had to watch because Sam was still there. He had not moved away, had not removed himself from her daily life on the reservation. He was present, visibly and consistently present, now building toward Emily the future that Leah had believed was being built toward her. Every gathering, every community event, every ordinary crossing of a small reservation life where you could not avoid the people who had hurt you because the community was too small and too interconnected to permit that kind of distance, brought her into contact with the evidence of her replacement. And Emily, her cousin, who had not asked for any of this either, who was as much a subject of the imprint as Sam was in a different way, who was now bound to a man she had not sought, through a mechanism neither of them had chosen. Emily bore her own guilt about what had happened to Leah, carried it visibly in their interactions, and Leah knew it. Leah could see it. The knowledge that Emily felt guilty was not comforting. If anything, it made it worse, because it meant that even in the privacy of Emily's interior life, Leah existed as a wound, as a consequence, as the person whose loss underwrote Emily's happiness. She knew about the scar. She had been told, in the careful and incomplete way, that information moved on the reservation, about the moment early in Sam's wolf life when he had lost control near Emily and the damage that had resulted. 3 lines down Emily's face, permanent, a record of what Sam was now and what that meant. Leah held that knowledge quietly and alone. One more thing she could not speak about directly, because speaking about it required acknowledging everything surrounding it, the whole impossible architecture of what their lives had become. She did not yet know she was about to become a wolf herself. She did not yet know that the grief and the stress and the particular chemistry of her lineage were conspiring toward a transformation that would take everything she had already lost and make it, against all probability, worse. She only knew that she had loved Sam Yulee completely, and that the world had taken that from her in a way she could neither understand nor accept, and that she was going to have to find a way to keep living inside that fact. She had not yet found it. It did not begin with a howl or a surge of power or anything that might later be remembered as significant. It began with heat, not the ordinary heat of fever, though it resembled that closely enough at first to be mistaken for it. This was something deeper and more structural, a heat that seemed to originate not in her skin or her bloodstream, but somewhere further in, somewhere closer to the center of whatever she was, as though the material she was made of was being asked to do something it had never done before and was generating friction in the attempt. It came in waves, each one slightly more intense than the last, and between the waves there was a trembling that she could not control and could not explain and could not make stop, no matter how still she tried to hold herself. She had been under extraordinary stress for months, The grief of losing Sam had not diminished so much as it had settled deeper, becoming part of the architecture of her daily existence rather than an acute emergency, which in some ways made it harder to carry because there was no longer a visible crisis to point to, just a permanent altered landscape of a life that looked, from the outside, like it was continuing normally. Harry's health was worsening in ways that required more attention and more management, and more of the particular emotional labor of watching a parent become someone who needs to be taken care of, when they have always been someone who took care of others. The role reversal was slow and undramatic and exhausting in a way that had no clear endpoint, no moment of resolution that would allow everyone to exhale and recalibrate. And somewhere beneath all of that, unacknowledged and unnamed, something in her blood had been waiting. The wolf gene ran through the Clearwater family, the way most inheritances run through families, quietly and without announcement, present in the bloodline, whether anyone thought about it or not. It had been there through Harry's generation and the generations before that, carried forward through the Quileute lineage like a seed that only germinates under specific conditions. Those conditions, historically, had always involved the presence of cold ones in the region, vampires whose proximity triggered something ancient in the blood of the tribe's descendants, activating a capacity for transformation that lay dormant the rest of the time. It was not a gift exactly, not in the way gifts are freely given. It was more like a clause in a very bold contract, a provision that activated whether the signatory wished it to or not. No woman had ever been a signatory before. No woman's blood had ever carried the gene in a form active enough to respond to the trigger. That was simply the truth of it, or had been, until Leah. The transformation, when it finally came, was not waiting any longer. She was alone when it happened. That at least was a mercy, though it did not feel like one in the moment. There was no warning beyond the heat and the trembling, no preparation, no framework within which to place what was suddenly happening to her body. The pain arrived without preamble, total and immediate, a restructuring that moved through her like something enormous, passing through something small, her bones making sounds that bones should not make, her muscles doing things that muscles should not do, her entire physical self coming apart and reassembling along lines she had never known existed. It was not a gradual process. It was not something that allowed for adjustment or bracing or any of the psychological preparation that makes difficult things survivable. It simply happened, all at once, and she had no choice but to be inside it. And then she was not herself. Or rather, she was herself in a form that had no precedent, four-legged and enormous and vibrating with senses so amplified that the world became briefly unbearable. Every sound a physical pressure, every scent a separate and overwhelming story, every shift of wind through the trees carrying information her human mind had never been equipped to process. The forest she had grown up alongside, the forest she had known her entire life as a backdrop, a constant, something present at the periphery of daily existence, was suddenly intimate in a way it had never been. She could hear things moving within it at distances that should have been impossible. She could smell the rain before it arrived, could distinguish individual animals by scent alone, could feel the temperature of the ground through her pores with a sensitivity that seemed almost like a form of communication. She was a wolf, The shock of the pack mind found her almost immediately. Before she had time to orient herself, before she had done anything more than stand in this impossible new body trying to understand what had happened, the voices were there. Not voices in the way of auditory hallucination, not external sounds she could locate in space, but presences, the consciousness of others pressing into her own awareness with an intimacy that was immediately and profoundly violating. She could feel them, could feel their shock, their confusion, their disbelief, their scrambling to understand what they were suddenly perceiving. She was in their minds, and they were in hers, and there was no door to close, no boundary to establish, no way to make any of it stop, no matter how desperately she needed it to. Sam's voice was among them. Of course it was. She had spent months building walls against him, constructing the careful architecture of a person learning to exist in proximity to her own devastation, learning to move through a reservation that still contained him, learning to breathe in rooms he had recently occupied, learning to answer when people asked how she was with the single syllable that indicated she was functioning and did not invite further inquiry. Those walls had been built slowly and at great cost, and she had not finished building them, would likely never have finished building them. But they had been something. They had been the difference between existing and not existing in any meaningful sense. In the space of one transformation, every wall she had built was simply gone. He was there, his thoughts and his guilt and his helpless sorrow pressing into her awareness, whether she wanted them or not. And she was there in his. Her grief and her fury, and the specific texture of everything she had lost lay completely bare before the man who had caused the losing. There was nowhere to go. There was nowhere inside herself that was still private, still hers alone, still protected from his awareness. They were bound together in the most intimate way imaginable by the very thing that had destroyed the intimacy between them. And the specific cruelty of that arrangement, however unintentional, was extraordinary in its precision. Sam's shock at her presence was itself something she was forced to feel. He had not expected this. No one had expected this. In all the history of the Quileute people, in all the generations of wolves who had phased before them, there had never been a female wolf. The gene did not activate in women. That was not a rule that had ever been written down or consciously articulated because it had never needed to be. It was simply something that had always been true, an assumption so foundational that it existed below the level of examination, the way certain truths do when they have never once been contradicted. Until now, until Leah. The pack's reaction to her presence was not unkind, but it was deeply and persistently uncomfortable in ways that were difficult to separate from the larger discomfort of everything surrounding it. Jacob, Embry, and Quill were young men who had entered their wolf lives with a particular understanding of what that life would look like, and Leah's presence disrupted that understanding in ways none of them had the language or the experience to navigate gracefully. They adjusted their behavior around her with a self-consciousness that she could feel as clearly as she could feel anything through the pack mind. A constant low-level awareness of her presence that expressed itself as awkwardness, as overcorrection, as a performance of normality that paradoxically made her more aware of how abnormal her presence was considered to be. She was unprecedented, which is a word that sounds significant and even honorable from a distance, but feels, from inside the experience of being it, simply like being a mistake the system had not anticipated and did not quite know what to do with. There was no tradition to consult, no elder who had navigated this before, no story that addressed what a female wolf was supposed to be or do or feel or want. She was writing something that had no genre, following a path that had no previous footprints, and she was doing it while also carrying every other weight she had already been carrying before the transformation added itself to the pile. Sam managed her with the careful guilt of someone navigating an impossible situation with entirely inadequate tools. He was her alpha now. That was the structure she'd been folded into without consent, the hierarchy she was now subject to, without having been given any choice in the matter, and the particular quality of that subjection deserves to be dwelt upon rather than glossed over. She was required to follow the orders of the person whose actions, however involuntary, had dismantled her life. She was required to run patrols at his direction, to phase at his command when the situation required it, to subordinate her own judgment to his authority in the way the pack structure demanded. The alpha bond was not a courtesy arrangement. It had weight, had pull, had consequences for resistance that went beyond the merely social. To refuse an alpha's direct command was to fracture something internal, something structural, something that made outright rebellion feel physically costly in ways that simple disagreement did not. She followed because the alternative was worse, but the following extracted something from her every time. A small withdrawal from a reserve that was already running low. There was no hiding how she felt. That was perhaps the most corrosive element of her new existence, the one that would do the most lasting damage to how she was perceived within the pack and within the community more broadly. The pack mind made the management of emotional presentation entirely unavailable. Every human being navigates social life through a degree of performance, through the ordinary and largely unconscious work of calibrating what is expressed and what is kept interior, what is shared, and what is processed privately. This calibration is not dishonesty. It is simply the basic social architecture that allows people to exist alongside each other without being overwhelmed by the full, unfiltered weight of everyone else's interior experience. The pack mind dissolved that architecture completely. When Leah was angry, they knew she was angry. When she was grieving, they felt the grief alongside her whether they wanted to or not. When she was humiliated, the humiliation was shared, distributed through the pack consciousness to everyone present, which did not reduce it but instead simply expanded the audience for it in ways that made everything harder. Her pain was not private. Her frustration was not private. The moments when she came closest to losing her hold on the functional surface of her daily life, the moments when the grief was freshest and the anger was sharpest, and the specific unfairness of everything she was enduring pressed up most urgently against the membrane of her composure. Those moments were communal property. Everyone in the pack had access to them. Everyone in the pack had to live alongside them. This was how she came to be known as difficult, as bitter, as the problem in an otherwise functional unit, not because her pain was excessive or her anger unjustified, but because her pain was visible in ways that no one else's pain was required to be, because the pack mind stripped her of the ordinary human ability to decide what she showed the world. others could have been experiencing equivalent interior struggles, and no one would have known unless they chose to share it. Leah had no such choice. Everything was already shared before she had the opportunity to decide whether to share it. Seth phased not long after she did. He was younger, still moving through his teenage years with the particular energy of someone who has not yet been given reason to question the fundamental generosity of the world. And the fact of his phasing landed in Leah with a complexity she could not quickly or cleanly unpack. There was immediate worry for him, the instinctive protective response of an older sister watching a younger sibling enter something dangerous. There was guilt, quieter and more difficult to examine. The thought that her own transformation, her stress, her prolonged grief might have played some role in activating the gene in him earlier than it otherwise would have appeared, as though she had been somehow contagious in a direction she had never intended. The thought that her suffering had cost him something was not one she could sit with easily. And there was the other thing, the thing beneath the worry and the guilt that she would not have admitted to anyone, but that was present nonetheless, pressing softly against the underside of everything else. Among all the presences in the pack mind that felt foreign and intrusive and relentlessly exposing, there was Seth, her brother, who loved her without condition and without the complicated history that colored every other relationship on the reservation. He was simply there, simply himself, simply the person who had always understood that Leah's sharpness was not the same as her coldness, who had never needed to be persuaded to see her clearly. Among all the things the transformation had taken from her, it had put Seth in the one space where she was most vulnerable, and whatever the circumstances, she was not sorry for that. She held on to it. In the absence of most of the things she had held on to before, she held on to her brother's uncomplicated presence in the pack, mind the way you hold on to the one familiar thing in a room full of things that have never been yours. The months that followed her transformation were an exercise in endurance, dressed up as daily life. She phased when required. She ran patrols. She existed within the pack structure with the grim compliance of someone who has assessed their available options and found them limited in every direction. She was not healing. She was not finding meaning within the transformation or discovering some version of herself that the wolf had revealed. She was not moving through grief towards something that resembled resolution. She was simply continuing day after day, which is its own form of strength, though it is rarely recognized as such because it looks from the outside like nothing at all and feels from the inside like very little more. She was the first female wolf in Quileute history. She would remain the only one. She carried that distinction not as a banner, but as a burden. One more unprecedented thing in a life that had accumulated more than its share of them. But she was still here, still running through the forest at night with a body that was faster and stronger than anything she had ever imagined. Still, beneath all the grief and the fury and the exhaustion of existing inside an impossible situation, undeniably and completely herself, she had not broken. Not yet. Not entirely. That, she would eventually come to understand, was not a small thing at all. There is a particular quality to suffering that has no clear endpoint. Acute pain has its own terrible mercy in that it demands full attention, occupies the entire foreground of experience leaves no room for anything else and therefore cannot be ignored or managed or set aside. It must simply be endured until it passes. But the kind of pain that doesn't pass, that instead settles into the background of daily life and becomes the permanent condition against which everything else is experienced. That kind of pain is harder in ways that are difficult to articulate because it is harder to point to. It does not announce itself. It simply colors everything, quietly and without interruption, for as long as it lasts. For Leah, it lasted. The weeks after her transformation stretched into months, and the months accumulated without producing the resolution that suffering is supposed to eventually deliver. She'd expected, on some level, that time would do what it was reputed to do, that the distance between herself and the loss of Sam would gradually widen until it became manageable, until she could look back at what she had been before without the looking costing her something. That expectation proved optimistic in ways she had not anticipated, because the ordinary mechanics of moving on from heartbreak require a basic condition that her life did not provide. They require distance. They require the ability to stop encountering the thing you are trying to move on from, to stop having it placed directly in your line of sight on a daily basis. Sam was everywhere. That was simply the geography of her existence. He was in the pack mind every time she phased. His consciousness pressed against hers with an intimacy she had never consented to and could not escape. He was on the reservation, present at the gatherings and the community events, and the ordinary daily crossings that the smallness of La Push made unavoidable. He was building a life with Emily in visible and consistent ways, constructing the future that Leah had once imagined for herself, with the steady, devoted attention of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. She could not avoid witnessing it. She could not create the distance that healing required because the distance was not available to her. And so she did not heal. She endured, which is a different thing entirely. Her relationship with Sam inside the pack dynamic was its own sustained difficulty. He was alpha, which meant his authority over her was structural rather than personal, built into the pack bond in ways that could not be simply ignored or argued away. She followed his commands because the alternative involved a kind of internal fracturing that she had brushed against enough times to understand she did not want to fully experience. But every act of compliance extracted something from her, a small cost paid against a reserve that was not replenishing at anywhere near the rate it was being depleted. She was not defiant in ways that caused open conflict. She was simply, consistently, exhausted by the effort of existing within a structure that required her to subordinate herself to the person whose presence was the primary source of her pain. Through the pack mind, she felt his guilt. That was one of the particular refinements of her situation that no one who had not experienced it could fully appreciate. Sam carried genuine remorse for what had happened to her, genuine sorrow for the pain his imprinting had caused, and Leah was forced to feel that remorse as clearly as she felt her own grief. His guilt did not comfort her. It did not reduce her pain or offer her any relief, or provide the acknowledgement she would have needed for it to function as any kind of restitution. Instead, it simply added another emotional texture to an interior landscape that was already overcrowded, made her responsible for navigating not only her own feelings about the situation, but the constant low-level awareness of his feelings about it as well. She had not asked to carry his guilt. She had enough of her own to carry. Daily life took on a rhythm that was functional without being meaningful. She phased when the patrol schedule required it. She ran the boundaries of the territory with the others, covering the ground quickly and efficiently, doing the work the pack existed to do. She returned home and occupied the space of her human life with the careful adequacy of someone performing a role rather than living it. She ate. She slept when sleep was available. She spoke to her mother with the practiced normalcy of someone who had become very skilled at not saying the things that were most true. Sue watched her with the particular attention of a mother who understands that her child is not all right and has made a calculation that pressing the point will not help. Sue was not someone who pushed when pushing would not produce anything useful. She loved Leah in the steady, non-performative way she had always loved her, and she left spaces in their interactions that Leah could fill with honesty if she chose to, and leave empty if she did not. Leah mostly left them empty, not because she did not want to be known by her mother, but because the full truth of her interior life was so tangled and so layered that she did not know how to begin the explanation without beginning at the very beginning. And the very beginning was Sam. And Sam was a subject that still sat in her chest like something with weight. Harry's health continued its slow deterioration through these months, and the management of that deterioration became another layer of daily responsibility that settled onto the household without ceremony. Harry was not dramatic about his condition. He was, in the way of men of his generation and his temperament, inclined to minimize what was happening to him and resist the accommodations his body increasingly required. He went fishing when he should have been resting. He showed up to community events when the sensible thing would have been to stay home. He was present and engaged and characteristically himself, and the effort that required, the energy he was spending to maintain that presence, was something Leah could see even when he could not. She helped without being asked, because asking was not the way things worked in their family, and because watching her father spend himself in the effort of appearing fine while quietly managing something serious activated every protective instinct she had. She took on things he would otherwise have done. She managed things without drawing attention to the managing. She was in this period a very good daughter in all the ways that do not get noticed, because they are the ways that prevent noticing from being necessary. And beneath all of it, beneath the pack obligations and the management of her father's health, and the daily performance of functional normalcy, ran the question she could not stop asking. Why her? Not in the sense of why had Sam imprinted on Emily, though that question had its own persistent residence in her, but the deeper why, the one that the transformation had added. Why had the gene activated in her? Why had something that had never happened in the entire history of the Quileute people happen now, in her body, in response to her particular combination of genetics and grief and circumstance? Was it random the way some things are simply random? The arbitrary firing of a biological mechanism without meaning or intention? Was it something about her specifically? Some quality of her lineage or her stress or her particular interior chemistry that had made her the one? Was it, in some formulation she could not quite dismiss as entirely irrational, punishment? A universe that had decided she had not yet had enough taken from her and had found one more thing to take. She did not believe in a punishing universe, not in any theological sense. But the human mind under sustained pressure looks for patterns whether patterns exist or not. And the pattern her mind kept returning to was one in which she was specifically and repeatedly singled out for a particular kind of loss. Sam, her human future, her privacy, her fertility, which was perhaps the quietest devastation of all. Her cycle had stopped when she began phasing, suspended by the biological demands of the wolf form, and what that meant for her future capacity to have children was something no one had addressed directly, because no one had needed to address it before. There was no precedent. There was no Quileute tradition that spoke to this, because no Quileute woman had ever been in this position. She was navigating it entirely alone, with no guidance and no reassurance, and no one who had gone before her to say that it would be all right, or that it would not. She was 20 years old, and she did not know if she would ever be able to have children. She did not know if the suspension was permanent or temporary, whether returning to human form long-term would restore what the phasing had interrupted, or whether the interruption was itself permanent. She held this uncertainty privately, mostly because speaking it aloud required a vulnerability she was not ready to offer to people who already found her difficult to be around. Seth moved through this period with the characteristic ease that was both his gift and, on her harder days, quietly difficult for her to witness. He had taken to pack life with an openness that she could not replicate, and had stopped trying to replicate, adapting to the new reality of his existence with the flexibility of someone who approaches unfamiliar things as interesting rather than threatening. He liked the Cullens, which was perhaps the most startling evidence of his particular temperament, given that the Cullens were the reason any of them were wolves, were the reason Harry's heart was straining under the pressure of a conflict that would not have existed without their presence. Seth found something likable in them anyway, found his way toward genuine affinity with people who should by every reasonable measure have been simply enemies. Leah found this baffling. She also found it on the days when she was being honest with herself, something adjacent to comfort. Seth's ease did not resolve anything. It did not change the fundamental conditions of her life or provide answers to the questions that kept her awake. But it meant that in the pack mind, alongside all the presences that were complicated and fraught and painful, there was her brother, uncomplicated and genuinely fine. And the existence of genuine fineness somewhere nearby was not nothing. She was still the only female wolf. She was still the only one navigating this without a map. She was still, every single day, choosing to continue. And that choice, invisible and unwitnessed and entirely unglamorous, was the truest thing about her in this period. She kept going. In the absence of anything better, she kept going. The thing about thresholds is that you rarely know you are standing at one until you have already crossed it. Leah had been standing at the edge of her particular threshold for a long time, long enough that the edge had started to feel like the permanent condition of her life, rather than the temporary position she was occupying on the way to somewhere else. She had adapted to the discomfort of it with the grim efficiency of someone who has run out of alternatives, had built a functional daily existence around the ongoing reality of being bound to Sam's pack, to Sam's authority, to the constant exposure of the pack mind that made privacy an abstraction she could remember wanting but could no longer access. She had stopped expecting the situation to change because nothing in her experience had given her reason to believe it would. Then Bella Swan came back from Italy and everything shifted. The details of Bella's situation arrived in the pack, mined the way most significant information arrived, partially and unevenly, filtered through the perspectives of the wolves who were closest to the relevant events. Jacob's feelings about Bella were not subtle or hidden or anything approaching private, and his feelings communicated the essential facts clearly enough, even when the specific details were incomplete. Bella was human still. Edward Cullen had returned. They were together. And now, months later, a new situation was developing at the Cullen house. Something that had moved beyond the ordinary boundaries of the uneasy peace the pack maintained with the vampire coven on their border. Bella was pregnant. The thing growing inside her was not human, or not entirely human, and it was growing with a speed and a violence that was destroying her from the inside. The pack could feel Jacob's terror about this through the pack mind, the specific texture of his helplessness as he watched someone he loved be consumed by something he could not fight. And alongside his terror was the information that was making Sam's jaw tighten and his decisions narrow down toward a single terrible point. The child was a threat. That was Sam's assessment, and Sam was not wrong to make it. Something half vampire growing at an unnatural rate, gestating inside a human body that was failing under the pressure, with capabilities and nature entirely unknown. Sam's responsibility as alpha was to his pack and to the people of La Push, and through that lens, the calculus was not complicated. The threat should be eliminated before it could materialize into something they could not control. A preemptive strike ended before the question of what it would become had time to answer itself. Leah understood the reasoning. She did not disagree with the logic of it in the abstract, but she was also present in the pack mind when Jacob's response to that reasoning arrived. And Jacob's response was not abstract. It was total and immediate and left no room for negotiation. He would not be part of an attack on Bella. He would not follow an order that resulted in her death. Whatever the justification, whatever the risk calculation, whatever the Alpha's authority demanded, the refusal came from somewhere deeper than rational argument could reach, and no amount of Sam's genuine and carefully reasoned authority could touch it. She watched it happen through the pack mind. Watched Jacob Black pull himself away from Sam's pack with the specific kind of effort that costs everything, that tears something internal in the tearing, that leaves marks on both the person leaving and the structure being left. It was not graceful. It was not clean. It was the messy and painful reality of someone choosing a principle over a belonging. And whatever Leah thought about Jacob's particular principle in this case, she recognized the shape of the choice. She had intimate experience with belonging to something that hurt you, with the daily cost of remaining inside a structure that required you to become smaller than you were in order to fit. And then she made her decision. She followed him. She would tell herself afterward, and would tell Jacob directly when he pushed her on it, that her primary motivation was simple and unsentimental. She needed out of Sam's pack. That was the truth of it, stripped of any framing that made it sound more complicated or more noble than it was. She needed to no longer be in the pack mind that contained Sam Yulee. She needed to no longer feel his guilt pressing against her consciousness every time she phased. to no longer be subject to his authority in the specific and grinding way the alpha bond made unavoidable. Jacob's departure had opened a door she had not known how to open herself, had created a structural possibility that had not existed before he tore away from Sam's pack, and she had walked through that door before she had fully articulated to herself that she was going to. Seth came with her, which she had not asked him to do and had not expected, and which moved her more than she let him see. The actual moment of separation from Sam's pack was not what she had imagined it would feel like. She had imagined relief, immediate and uncomplicated, the cessation of a pain that had been constant for so long. She had almost stopped registering it as pain. And relief was there, genuinely, present in the first moments after the break, like the release of a pressure she had not fully appreciated until it was gone. But there was also something else, something she had not anticipated and did not welcome. Loss. The pack mind. Even Sam's pack mind. Even that specific configuration of shared consciousness that had been the instrument of so much of her suffering had also been the structure she had been living inside. And structures have a way of becoming necessary even when they are harmful. She was out. She was finally, after everything, out, and the freedom of it was real, and the disorientation of it was also real, and both things occupied her simultaneously without resolving into a single clean emotion. Jacob was not initially glad to have her. That was simply true, and she did not hold it against him, particularly because she understood where it came from. Jacob had left Sam's pack in an act of profound personal conviction, had fractured one of the most fundamental bonds in his world for the sake of someone he loved, and he had done it alone, or had intended to. Her arrival made his small rebellion into something slightly larger and considerably more complicated, and his first responses to her presence were colored by the assumption that her motivations were self-serving in ways that had nothing to do with his situation. He was not entirely wrong about that, but he was not entirely right either, and Leah's patience for being misread had never been generous. She told him so, not with the performance of injured dignity that the situation might have invited from someone less direct, but plainly and without decoration, in the way she addressed most things she considered important enough to address at all. She told him that she was aware he did not want her there. She told him that her reasons for coming were her own, and that she was not going to justify them to his satisfaction, because his satisfaction was not what she was here for. She told him that she was a wolf, and she was capable, and she was choosing to be in this pack for reasons that were sufficient to her, and that his discomfort with those reasons did not change the facts of her capability or her presence. Jacob heard her. Not immediately, not without resistance, but he heard her. What followed was not friendship. Not at first, not quite. It was something more cautious and more honest than friendship. Something that resembled the dynamic that develops between people who are forced into proximity by circumstances neither of them chose, and who gradually discover that the other person is more worth knowing than they had initially estimated. They had both lost things. They had both been reshaped by forces that had not consulted them. They were both, in their different ways, navigating the specific difficulty of caring deeply about something that their better judgment suggested they should care about less. There was a recognition in that, even when neither of them would have articulated it as such. The pack mind of Jacob's small pack was startlingly different from Sam's. Smaller, obviously. 3 wolves rather than the larger configuration she had been part of. And that smallness changed the quality of the shared consciousness in ways she had not anticipated. It was less overwhelming. There was more space within it, more room for individual thought to exist, without being immediately crowded by the accumulated weight of everyone else's interior life. She was still exposed, still unable to fully contain her thoughts when she phased, but the exposure felt different when the audience consisted of her brother and a boy, who was still getting used to her presence. Less like being seen by people who had already formed their conclusions, and more like being seen by people who were still in the process of forming them. She began running patrols for Jacob's pack with a competence that no one questioned, because there was nothing to question. She was fast, and she was skilled, and she understood the territory as well as anyone, had been covering this ground since her own transformation, knew where the boundaries ran, and what the land felt like at every hour and in every weather. She was useful, genuinely demonstrably useful, which was a simpler and less complicated thing to be than she had been in Sam's pack, where her usefulness had always been shadowed by her reputation as a difficult element. Jacob's discomfort with her presence diminished incrementally, and then quite suddenly, in the way that recalibrations often happen, gradually and then all at once. There was a specific conversation that shifted things, one that she had not initiated but had not avoided when Jacob moved toward it. He asked her about imprinting. Not tactfully, not with the careful approach of someone who understood how the subject sat in her interior life, but with the blunt directness of someone who needed to understand something and did not know how to ask for the understanding gently. She told him the truth. She told him that she hated it. Not Sam specifically, not anymore. Not with the acute and consuming hatred of the early months, but the concept itself, the mechanism, the way it bypassed every human quality she valued. Choice, agency, the earned intimacy of 2 people deciding toward each other over time. Imprinting replaced all of that with compulsion, dressed the compulsion up as destiny, and asked the people affected by it to call it beautiful. Sam had not chosen to leave her. She knew that. She had always known it, but knowing it did not make the leaving less complete, and she was unwilling to call something beautiful simply because the person it had hurt had not intended the hurting. Jacob listened without interrupting, which was more than most people had offered her. And when she finished, he did not argue, did not suggest that she was being unfair or that her perspective was missing something essential. He simply sat with what she had said, and the sitting with it, the refusal to immediately correct or diminish or redirect, was something she had not been given often enough, and that she felt the value of quietly. She also told him what she had not told many people. The question of her fertility, the suspended cycle, the uncertainty about what the phasing had altered permanently and what it had only interrupted. She told him this not because she required his sympathy, but because she was in his pack mind, and he would have felt the edges of it eventually anyway. And she preferred to give information directly, rather than have it discovered around her. Jacob's response was not what she expected. There was no discomfort, no visible effort to move past the subject quickly. There was simply acknowledgement, simple and uncomplicated, of what she had said and what it cost her to carry it. She had not known how much she needed that particular acknowledgement until she had it. The situation at the Cullen house continued to worsen. Bella's condition was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated, and the urgency of it pressed against the background of everything else. A constant reminder that the reason this small, fragile pack existed at all was because something genuinely dangerous was happening inside those glass walls, and the question of how it would resolve had not yet been answered. Leah had chosen her side. She had not chosen it for Bella, had not chosen it for the Cullens, had not chosen it out of for the Cullens, had not chosen it out of any particular conviction about what the right outcome of this situation was. She had chosen it because it was the only side that gave her something she had not had in a very long time. The freedom to be herself, in whatever form that self was currently taking, without having to apologize for the space she occupied. That was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. There is a particular kind of irony that is too precise to be accidental, that arrives in your life with such exact and pointed specificity that it seems almost designed, as though whatever force arranges the circumstances of human experience has a sense of humor that runs toward the surgical. Leah Clearwater, who had lost everything she had lost because of the Cullen family's presence on the border of her world, who had been transformed into something she had not chosen because vampires had settled too close to La Push and activated the ancient mechanism in her blood, was now standing guard outside their house, protecting them. She turned this fact over in her mind during the long hours of patrol with the detached analytical attention of someone who has moved past the point where irony produces emotion and arrived at the place where it simply produces observation. She was here. This was what she was doing. The reasons were not sentimental, and she was not going to pretend they were. Jacob was here because of Bella, and she was here because of Jacob's pack, and Seth was here because he went where she went, and none of that added up to anything resembling a simple or comfortable set of motivations. But the motivations were real, and the commitment was real, and she ran her patrols with the same efficiency she brought to everything she had decided to do, regardless of how she felt about the circumstances that had produced the decision. The Cullen house was different from anything she had expected, though she would not have admitted to having had specific expectations. It was not dark. It was not the gothic architecture of every story she had ever heard about vampires, the cold stone and the absence of light, and the general atmosphere of menace that folklore assigned to the dwellings of the undead. It was modern and bright and almost aggressively open. All glass walls and pale wood, the kind of house that seemed designed to let the outside in rather than keep it out. She found this detail irritating in a way she could not entirely justify, as though they had no right to live in a house that looked like that, as though something about the pleasantness of their home was an additional imposition on top of all the other impositions their existence had produced in her life. The pleasantness did not make them less dangerous. It did not make them less responsible for what their presence had set in motion. It simply made them harder to hold in the simple configuration of enemy, which was an inconvenience she resented. She kept this feeling contained, or tried to. The pack mind remained indifferent to her attempts at containment. Jacob noticed her feelings and said nothing, which she respected. Seth noticed and offered a brief and gently intended observation that she silenced with a look before it could develop into anything requiring a response. The Cullens themselves were largely unbothered by her presence in ways that she found both practically useful and faintly maddening. They did not attempt to win her over. They did not perform gratitude for her protection in ways that would have obligated her to acknowledge it or respond to it warmly. They simply accepted the arrangement with the composure of people who had spent enough time navigating complicated relationships with wolves to understand that forcing warmth where wariness existed was counterproductive and probably insulting to everyone involved. It was, she admitted privately, a reasonable approach. She did not reward them for it with any outward softening, but she noted it. Carlyle was the one she found easiest to be neutral toward, which surprised her until she thought about it more carefully. He was the one who had created the terms of this arrangement without her input and without her consent, had introduced vampirism into the Pacific Northwest centuries ago in a way that had cascading consequences for every generation of Quileute wolves who came after. He was, in the most literal sense, the origin point of everything that had happened to her. And yet, he moved through the world with such consistent and unperformative decency that sustaining active hostility toward him required more energy than she could justify spending. He was not performing goodness for her benefit. He was simply good in the exhausting and inconvenient way of people who have made their ethical commitment so thoroughly their own that they no longer require conscious effort to maintain. She did not like owing anything to that quality, but she recognized it. Edward was the complication she had not fully anticipated. She had known, in the abstract way that pack information conveyed things, that Edward could hear the thoughts of the wolves in their human form the way he could hear any human thoughts. She had understood this intellectually before she arrived, had filed it away as a relevant tactical detail, had told herself it did not change anything substantive about the arrangement. She had not fully reckoned with what it meant until she was actually within range of it, until she felt the awareness of being heard extending beyond the pack mind to include something external, something that was not the familiar pressure of shared wolf consciousness, but something colder and more precise and entirely outside her control. Edward did not react to what he heard from her in any obvious way. He was too controlled for that, too practiced at managing his responses to the constant intrusion of other people's interior lives. He did not flinch at her hostility or acknowledge her complicated feelings about the Cullen family with anything beyond the most carefully neutral expression. But she knew he heard. She knew that the carefully maintained functional surface she presented to the world was not opaque to him, that the things she held most privately were available to his awareness every time she was within range. There was nothing she could do about this. It was simply a condition of the arrangement, one more form of involuntary exposure in a life that had already provided more of that than she had ever wanted. She did not like him. She was not going to like him. But she recognized the quality of his restraint in not using what he heard against her, and she respected it with the particular grudging specificity of someone who respects things they would prefer not to respect. Seth had no such reservations about any of them. Seth's relationship with the Cullen family developed with the speed and ease that characterized all of Seth's relationships. The natural warmth of him finding its way toward genuine connection without apparent effort or deliberation. He liked Edward. He found the family interesting rather than threatening, moved through his interactions with them with an openness that cost him nothing, because openness was simply his default mode of operating in the world. He was particularly drawn to Edward in ways that Leah observed, without fully understanding, some quality of mutual recognition that seemed to transcend the obvious differences between them. Watching Seth be genuinely comfortable in a situation that cost Leah constant effort to simply tolerate produced a complex emotional response that she examined with more honesty than she usually brought to her own interior states. She did not want to be easy with them the way Seth was easy with them. She was not willing to release what they represented in the history of her life simply because they were behaving decently in the present moment. History did not become irrelevant because the present was manageable. And yet, there was something in Seth's ease that she found herself reaching toward without quite arriving at. Something that suggested the weight she was carrying was at least partly optional, at least partly a choice she was making, however justified the reasons behind the choice. She did not act on that suggestion, but she noticed it, which was more than she would have managed 6 months earlier. The situation inside the house worsened as the weeks moved forward. Bella's condition deteriorated with a speed that was visible even from the outside, even from the distance of patrol, even without direct observation. She was being consumed. That was the only accurate description of what was happening. The thing growing inside her was taking everything she had and leaving progressively less of her behind. And the Cullens were managing this reality with the controlled urgency of people who have exhausted several approaches and are still searching for a solution, while the timeline compresses around them. Jacob's anguish about this was continuous and deeply present in the pack mind, and Leah absorbed it alongside her own observations without comment. She had complicated feelings about Bella that she was not particularly interested in organizing into anything coherent. The girl was the center of gravity around which this entire arrangement orbited. The reason a small wolf pack was spending its days and nights in the proximity of vampires. The reason Jacob had fractured his relationship with Sam's pack, and she had followed him through the fracture. Bella had not created these circumstances deliberately. Leah understood that, but understanding it did not simplify the feelings it produced. What she could not dismiss and found herself returning to during the longer patrol shifts with something approaching involuntary respect was the quality of Bella's stubbornness. The girl was dying by increments, and she was refusing to let anyone make the central decisions for her, refusing to prioritize her own survival over the things she had decided mattered more. There was something in that refusal, in the grip of it, that Leah recognized from the inside. The insistence on remaining the author of your own existence even when that insistence frightened everyone around you. The refusal to let other people's fear become the governing principle of your choices. Leah disagreed with Bella's choices. She found them excessive in ways that were difficult to separate from her more general feelings about everything surrounding them. But the impulse beneath the choices, the deep structural insistence on self-determination, was something she understood without translation. The conversation about imprinting happened during a quiet night patrol, one of those stretches where the absence of immediate threat created room for the things that had been accumulating. Jacob raised it with the direct and slightly clumsy approach he brought to most subjects he found difficult. and Leah met it without the deflection she would have used with someone she trusted less or knew less well. She told him she was afraid she was broken. Not broken in the catastrophic sense, not non-functional, not someone who had stopped being able to move through the world. She was functional. No one could look at her patrol record or her commitment to the pack or the quality of her performance under pressure and argue that she was not functional. But broken in the specific sense of being unable to release something that had ended, unable to do the internal work of detaching from Sam in any way that actually produced detachment rather than just the performance of it. She'd been carrying him for so long that she was no longer certain what she would be carrying if she put him down. The grief had become structural. She had built so much of her interior landscape around the fact of what she had lost that she genuinely did not know what the landscape looked like without it. Jacob did not offer her easy comfort or tell her that time would resolve what time had not yet resolved. He told her that he understood what it was to love someone who could not be reached, who existed on the other side of an obstacle that had nothing to do with the quality of the love on either side of it. He said it plainly and without self-pity, from the center of his own unresolved situation, rather than from any comfortable distance of prior resolution. And Leah heard in it the specific honesty of someone who was not performing understanding, but actually experiencing it alongside her. It was one of the better conversations she had in this period. She did not tell him that, but she thought it, and the pack mind being what it was, he probably knew. She told him about her fertility in the same conversation, not because she had planned to, but because the conditions were right for it, in the way that certain conversations create conditions for the next thing to be said. The suspended cycle, the uncertainty about whether what the phasing had interrupted was interrupted temporarily or permanently, the specific loneliness of being the only person in a situation so unprecedented that no tradition spoke to it. No elder had guidance for it. No predecessor had left any record of navigating it. She held no expectation of what his response would be. She was giving him information rather than asking for something. His response was not pity, and it was not the visible discomfort of someone who wanted to move past a subject they found difficult. It was simply the full attention of someone taking seriously a thing that deserved to be taken seriously, sitting with the weight of it without trying to reduce it to something more manageable. That particular response, uncomplicated and complete, settled something in her that had been unsettled since the first time she had sat alone with the full implications of what the phasing might have cost her. The newborn army was building somewhere beyond the immediate perimeter of their daily reality, taking shape through the intelligence the pack gathered and the visions Alice provided in fragments. Victoria's design was becoming clearer, even when its specific details remained obscure. She was constructing something intended to overwhelm through sheer number rather than individual power. Was creating an army of newborns whose combined force would exceed what the Cullen family could manage alone. The scale of what was coming required a response that went beyond anything Jacob's small pack could provide independently, and the conversation about cooperation between the Wolves and the Cullens, real cooperation rather than the parallel arrangement they had been maintaining, became unavoidable. Leah absorbed the development of this plan with the pragmatic attention she brought to tactical information. assessing what it required of her, without allowing the assessment to become another layer of sustained anxiety. She was going to fight. That was simply the fact of it. Whatever her feelings about the Cullens, whatever the complicated history of her relationship to the entire situation, she was in this pack, and this pack was going into that fight, and she was going to be present and capable and entirely herself when it came. She ran her patrols through the lengthening days of late spring with the focused attention of someone who has simplified their situation down to its essential elements. The rest, the grief and the history and the unanswered questions about her future, would still be there after. It had always still been there after. That, at least, was something she had learned to count on. She kept running. Forward, always forward, into whatever was coming next. The newborn army came on a night when the mountain was cold, and the clouds sat low over the trees, and the air carried the particular stillness that precedes violence. Leah had been in this body long enough to know what her senses were telling her, before her conscious mind had finished processing the information. The smell of them arrived first, sharp and wrong and numerous, carried on the wind down from the higher elevations where the Cullens had chosen to meet the threat, away from human proximity, away from forks, away from the ordinary world that continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware of what was happening in the dark above it. She had prepared for this. They all had. The training sessions with the Cullens in the days before the battle had been strange in the particular way that necessary things sometimes are. The strangeness of doing something sensible that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Jasper had led the preparation with the quiet authority of someone who had been in more fights than anyone present, and had survived them all through a combination of skill and strategic intelligence that had nothing to do with brute force. Leah had listened to him with the attention she gave to information she intended to use, setting aside every other feeling the situation produced in favor of the practical reality that good preparation kept you alive and poor preparation did not. She was going to stay alive. That was her baseline commitment, simple and non-negotiable. The wolves and the Cullens moved into position as the newborns descended, and Leah felt the particular clarity that came with imminent action. The way the noise of everything else fell away when the immediate demands of a situation became total. The pack mind sharpened, became more focused, the shared consciousness of three wolves orienting toward the same threat with the collective efficiency that was the pack's primary tactical advantage. She knew where Jacob was. She knew where Seth was. She knew the shape of the ground between them, and could feel through the pack mind the quality of their readiness, which was solid, which held. The fighting was nothing like the training. Training had parameters and endpoints, and the safety of a situation where no one was actually trying to destroy anyone else. The newborns had no parameters. They were young in their vampire lives, and therefore burning with the particular uncontrolled power of the newly made, stronger than older vampires in raw physical terms, because the human blood that had transformed them was still fresh in their systems, still fueling a strength that would diminish as they aged into their immortality. They were also undisciplined, which Jasper had told them to expect, and which proved accurate. They fought with the frenzied energy of creatures who had not yet learned to think during violence, who relied on power rather than strategy. This was the advantage the wolves and the Cullens could exploit, and they exploited it. Leah moved through the fight with a ferocity that surprised her only in retrospect. In the moment, there was no room for surprise, no space for any internal observation beyond the immediate requirements of staying alive and doing damage. She was fast, faster than the newborns expected, faster than they had apparently been told to anticipate, and she used that speed with the ruthless efficiency of someone who has learned not to hesitate in the moments that do not permit hesitation. Then she heard Seth. The sound came through the pack mind before it came through her ears, the sharp spike of pain and surprise that was her brother's consciousness, registering something that had gone wrong. She was already moving before she had fully processed what she was responding to, crossing the ground between them with the full extension of her speed, following the thread of Seth's presence in the pack mind to where he was, to where a newborn had him, at an angle that was wrong, that was dangerous, that was the kind of wrong that did not resolve favorably if no one intervened. She hit the newborn with everything she had. The impact was total and immediate, and it cost her. The newborn redirected its full force toward her in the moment of collision, and the blow she took in Seth's place landed with the weight of a creature whose strength she had not fully accounted for in the split second of her decision. Something cracked. More than one thing. She felt it the way you feel significant damage in wolf form, as information rather than immediately as pain, her body registering what had happened with a clinical precision that the adrenaline of the fight made temporarily manageable. She went down, rolled, came back up with the automatic recovery of a wolf whose body is working to repair itself even as the damage is still being assessed. Seth was clear. That was the relevant fact. Seth was clear and already back in the fight and whole. And what she had absorbed instead of him was already beginning to mend in the accelerated way of wolf healing, knitting back toward function with a speed that would have seemed miraculous in any other context. It hurt. It hurt considerably, and she ran through the remainder of the fight carrying that hurt without letting it change what she was doing, because the alternative was letting it change what she was doing, and she was not willing to do that. Afterward, when the last of the newborns had been dealt with, and the mountain had gone quiet again, and the strange coalition of wolves and vampires was standing together in the cold early morning with the evidence of what they had done scattered around them, Jasper found her. He looked at her with the assessment of someone who understood what it meant to take a hit meant for someone else. To make that particular calculation in the fraction of a second, it was available to be made. And what he said was brief and genuine, and she received it without deflecting it away, which for Leah was its own form of progress. She had saved her brother. That was the thing she held, quietly, and without making anything of it aloud. Whatever else this existence had been, whatever it had taken from her, she had been in a position to save her brother, and she had done it without hesitation. She was not sure she had known before that moment exactly what she would do when the moment came. Now she knew. Then the news from the Cullen house reached them. Bella had not survived the birth in the ordinary sense of the word. The child had arrived under circumstances that Leah received second-hand through Jacob's overwhelming response in the pack mind, and through the fragments of information that filtered through afterward. And what those circumstances amounted to was this: Bella Swan was dead. or was undergoing the process of becoming something that was not dead, but was not what she had been. The venom was in her. The transformation had begun. She was gone from her human life in the irrevocable way of all transformations. The door behind her closed permanently. The person she had been replaced by someone who would wear her face into an entirely different kind of existence. Jacob's reaction in the pack mind was enormous and uncontained. Grief and rage, and something else that Leah could not immediately identify, crashing through the shared consciousness with a force that made her involuntarily present for all of it. She did not try to shut it out. She simply held it. Held him through the pack mind the way you hold someone when holding is the only available response. And then something shifted in him. Something changed with a totality and an immediacy that she felt as clearly as she had ever felt anything through the pack mind. A reorientation so complete, it was like feeling a compass find north after spinning without direction. A settling into a new fixed point that had not existed moments before. Jacob had imprinted on Renesmee. Leah went still. Of all the people in this situation, of all the wolves who might have received this information with complicated feelings, Leah understood with a precision that went beyond rational analysis exactly what had just happened and exactly what it meant. She had been the one who raged most vocally against imprinting, who had articulated most clearly the violence it did to the people who were not the ones imprinted upon, who had lived inside the wreckage of what it left behind with an intimacy no one else present could claim. She had made her feelings about the mechanism known, had not softened them for anyone's comfort, had refused to call it beautiful when her experience of its consequences had been anything but. And now Jacob, the person who had listened to her articulate all of that, who had sat with her anger about it without dismissing it, who had understood it from the inside of his own frustrated love for an unavailable person, had been claimed by it. She held what she felt about this with great care and without speaking it. The feeling was not simple, and she was not going to pretend it was. There was the layer of it that was personal, the specific echo of her own history, the recognition of a pattern she had hoped would not repeat itself in the life of someone she had come to care about. There was the layer of it that was about her own future, the implication that if Jacob had imprinted, if the mechanism had reached into his life, the likelihood that it might reach into hers had not disappeared the way she had occasionally allowed herself to hope it had. There was the layer of it that was simply exhaustion, the feeling of someone who has been navigating impossible things for a long time, encountering one more impossible thing and having to find the energy to continue navigating. But there was also, beneath all of that, something she had not expected, something quiet and almost unwilling, something that looked, when she examined it honestly, like the early edge of relief, because Jacob's imprint on Renesmee changed the structure of the threat. Sam's pack was mobilizing, prepared to treat the child as the danger they had always assessed it to be, prepared to act on that assessment with the full authority of the alpha and the full force of the pack. But an imprint changed things. An imprint was the one thing in the Quileute tradition that superseded alpha authority in certain configurations, that made the imprinted person untouchable through the same structure that governed everything else. Jacob would invoke that. She knew he would. And Sam, whatever his feelings about the situation, would have to hear it. The confrontation happened quickly. Jacob stood his ground with the absolute certainty of someone who is no longer negotiating, who has moved beyond the place where other people's arguments reach him, and he invoked the one protection the tradition provided. Sam heard it, the pack heard it, and the aggression that had been building toward the Cullen house redirected, itself settled, found no clear path forward against something the tradition itself protected. Leah stood behind Jacob through all of it, present and ready, saying nothing. Her presence was his own statement. She had made her choice months ago when she had followed him out of Sam's pack, and she was making it again now, in this moment, with everything it implied and everything it cost her. The child was here. The situation had changed, and whatever came next, she was going to face it from exactly where she was standing. That was enough. For now, that was entirely enough. The weeks after Reneme's birth settled into a new kind of ordinary, which is to say, they were not ordinary at all, but simply less acutely chaotic than what had immediately preceded them. The crisis had not ended so much as it had shifted shape, transformed from the immediate and physical emergency of Bella's failing body and the newborn threat into something slower and more diffuse, a sustained tension with a fixed endpoint somewhere on the horizon that everyone could see, but no one could fully prepare for. The Volturi were coming. That was the fact that organized everything in this period. The knowledge that sat beneath every conversation and every decision like a persistent low frequency, present always, even when not directly addressed. Leah existed inside this period with a particular quality of attention she had developed over the past year. The ability to remain present to immediate demands without being consumed by the larger dread that the situation might have otherwise produced. She had learned this, or perhaps had always had the capacity for it, and had simply been forced to develop it more deliberately than most people are. The future was uncertain. The future had been uncertain for a long time. She had found ways to continue functioning inside uncertainty that did not require the uncertainty to resolve first, and she brought those ways with her into this new configuration of the same basic challenge. Jacob's pack had become her pack in a way that was no longer provisional or circumstantial, but simply true. She had followed him for reasons that were initially about escape, about the relief of separation from Sam's pack mind, about the basic survival instinct of removing herself from something that was causing her ongoing harm. Those reasons remain valid. She did not disavow them or reframe them into something more flattering in retrospect, but they were no longer the whole of the reason. She was here because this was where she belonged now, because Jacob and Seth were her family in the way that families are sometimes made rather than born into, forged by shared difficulty rather than assigned by blood. She was here because leaving would mean losing the only structure she had found in years that asked her to be exactly herself, rather than a more manageable version of herself. She stayed, not out of obligation, not out of inertia, but out of genuine choice. That distinction mattered to her more than she would have articulated to anyone. Her relationship with Jacob had continued its gradual and unannounced deepening throughout this period. It was not romance. She was clear about that in her own mind, clearer than she needed to be given, that no one had suggested otherwise, which perhaps indicated that she was working through something about it, whether she acknowledged the working through or not. It was something else, something she did not have a precise name for and had trying to name. It was the particular closeness of two people who have seen each other at their worst and have continued to show up for each other anyway, who have been honest with each other in ways that honesty is usually too costly to allow, who have developed a trust that is not naive because it has been tested and has held. She understood Jacob in ways that had not been available to her at the beginning of this arrangement. She understood his loyalty and his stubbornness and the specific quality of his grief over Bella, and the way his imprint on Renesmee had reorganized his interior life without erasing everything that had come before. She understood him, and he understood her, and that mutual understanding, so simple in its description and so rare in actual experience, was something she was not willing to minimize by giving it a label that might reduce it. The imprint. She still had feelings about it, would likely always have feelings about it, but the feelings had changed in texture over the weeks since Renesmee's birth. The acute edge of them had softened, not because she had resolved anything intellectually about the mechanism itself. She had not, and probably would not, but because the practical reality of Jacob's imprint had proven different from what her experience of Sam's imprint had prepared her to expect. Jacob had not disappeared into it the way Sam had disappeared into his connection to Emily. He was still present, still himself, still available to the relationships he had built, still capable of being a person who existed in relation to other people, and not only in relation to the one he had imprinted on. The imprint had added something to his life rather than replacing everything that had been there before, and watching that distinction in practice produced a quiet recalibration in Leah that she accepted without making too much of it. Renesmee was a separate and more complicated adjustment. Leah had not expected to have feelings about the child beyond the general acknowledgement that the child existed, and that the pack's relationship to her was now structured by Jacob's imprint in ways that were not going to change. She had not expected to be in proximity to Renesmee often enough for anything beyond that general acknowledgement to develop, but the situation put them in proximity regularly, and the child was not what Leah had been prepared to encounter. Renesmee was strange, clearly and profoundly strange, growing at a rate that defied every biological norm and demonstrating capabilities that had no precedent. She was also, and Leah found this the most disarming quality she possessed, entirely without pretense. She did not perform anything. She responded to the world as she found it, with a directness that in a human child would have read as simple lack of socialization, but in her read as something closer to a genuine incapacity for artifice. She looked at Leah and seemed to see her without the filters that most people applied, without the reputation or the history or the accumulated impression of a person considered difficult. She simply looked, and what she appeared to find was not threatening or unwelcome, and the experience of being looked at that clearly without the usual freight of expectation and conclusion was more affecting than Leah would have predicted. She did not become warm toward Renesmee in any sudden or sentimental way. She was not someone who did things suddenly or sentimentally, but she stopped actively holding herself at a distance from the child, stopped treating proximity to her as something to be managed and minimized, and allowed the simple fact of Renesmee's existence to exist alongside her own, without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. This was, for Leah, a significant movement. Sue's situation occupied a different layer of her attention during this period. Her mother had found her way towards something with Charlie Swan, something that was still in its early and careful stages, but that was unmistakably a companionship, a mutual presence that both of them were choosing, and that was doing something genuinely good for Sue's life. Leah had complicated feelings about this that she examined with more honesty than comfort. The complication was not that she begrudged her mother happiness. She did not. She understood what it meant to watch a parent manage the aftermath of profound loss, had watched Sue navigate Harry's death with the particular stoicism of someone who intends to survive rather than simply endure. And she wanted for her mother a life that was more than mere survival. The complication was something older and less rational than any of that. It was the residue of grief, the way her father's absence was made newly present by the evidence that the space he had occupied was beginning to be filled by something else. It was the irreducible selfishness of mourning, the part of grief that does not want the world to move on because moving on implies a finality to the loss that staying still allows you to defer. Charlie was a decent man. Leah knew this, could assess it clearly and without significant reservation. He was steady and kind in the quiet, undemonstrative way of someone who shows care through action rather than declaration. He was good for Sue in ways that were visible even through the complicated lens of Leah's feelings about the whole arrangement. She did not interfere. She did not express the complicated feelings in ways that would make them Sue's problem to manage. She held them internally and let her mother move towards something good, and the holding of them without acting on them was its own form of the love she had for her mother. Seth remained the clearest and most uncomplicated thing in her life, which was both a comfort and occasionally a source of that specific fondness that is adjacent to envy. He had taken to the new equilibrium with the same ease he had brought to every other stage of their shared experience, had found his place in the expanded network of relationships that surrounded Renesmee's existence without apparent effort or adjustment period. He liked the Cullens openly and without apology, had developed genuine friendships within the family that he maintained with the consistency of someone who does not require his relationships to be simple in order to be real. He was happy, or something close enough to happy that the distinction was primarily academic, and watching him be happy was one of the few uncomplicated pleasures of Leah's current existence. She watched him and thought sometimes about the version of herself that had existed before all of this. The girl who'd been happy in a similarly uncomplicated way, who had moved through her life with the quiet confidence of someone whose foundation had never shifted. She did not mourn that girl the way she had mourned her for much of the past 2 years. Something had changed in her relationship to her own past. Some shift in how she held the before in relation to the now. The before was real, and the happiness in it had been real, and losing it had been genuinely devastating, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But the before was also finished, completely and irrevocably finished, and she was still here, and the person she'd become through all of the finishing was not simply the ruined version of the person she had been. She was something else, something more complicated and more resilient and more honest about the actual texture of existence than she could have been without the loss. She was not grateful for the loss. She was not going to perform a redemption narrative that required her to be grateful for the things that had broken her in order to appreciate what she had become. That kind of narrative required the breaking to be secretly worthwhile, and she was not convinced the breaking had been worthwhile. She was only convinced that she had survived it, and that the surviving had produced someone she was beginning, cautiously and without fanfare, to find worth being. The Volturi were coming. That remained true. The gathering of witnesses proceeded around her with the organized urgency of people preparing for a confrontation that might be the last significant event of their existence. Vampires arrived from distances she could barely conceptualize, drawn by the Cullens network and by the particular significance of what was being assembled. The meadow near the Cullen house was being prepared, metaphorically, if not literally, as the site of something that would either resolve peacefully or would not resolve at all. Leah looked at this preparation with clear eyes. She was not a vampire. She was not a witness in the formal sense of what the Cullens were assembling. She was a wolf, mortal by the standards of what would be gathered on that field, capable of being killed in ways that the immortal beings around her were not. She understood this. She had assessed it with the same pragmatic attention she brought to threat evaluation, and had arrived at the same place she always arrived at. She was going to be there anyway. That was simply who she was. She ran her patrols as the day shortened and the tension built, feeling the ground beneath her paws with the particular attention of someone who is aware that the ordinary things might not always be available, and has decided to be present to them while they are. The forest, the cold air, the sound of the ocean somewhere distant, always present, always the same. The pack mind of the two people she had chosen to remain beside. These things were hers, not by inheritance or transformation or any force that had imposed them on her without consultation, but by choice, by the repeated daily decision to remain, to continue, to be here. For the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The morning the Volturi came, the world looked the same as it always did. That was the detail Leah kept returning to in the hours before they arrived. The persistence of the ordinary surface of things in the face of what was approaching. The sky was the same grey, it was always grey. The trees stood in the same configurations they had always occupied. The cold came off the ground in the same way it always did in deep winter, rising through the soles of her feet when she was human, and registering as information rather than discomfort when she was wolf. The world did not rearrange itself to signal that something significant was happening inside it. It simply continued, indifferent and unchanging, while the people within it prepared for something that might end several of their lives before the day was finished. She had spent the previous days in a state of heightened and sustained alertness that was different from the ordinary vigilance of patrol. Patrol vigilance was habitual, almost automatic by now. The background processing of a wolf body that had been doing this work long enough to do it without requiring her full conscious attention. This was different. This was the specific quality of awareness that comes when you understand that what is coming is not something that can be handled by habit or automatic response, that it will require everything you have and possibly more than that, and that the outcome is genuinely uncertain in ways that ordinary threats are not. The Volturi were ancient. That was the word that kept presenting itself when she tried to find the accurate description. and it was the right word in a sense that went beyond simple chronology. They were ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, not merely old, but constituted differently from the things around them, shaped by so many accumulated years that the shaping had produced something qualitatively other. Aro, Caius, Marcus. She had heard enough about them through the pack mind and through the Cullens' careful briefings to understand that she was not equipped by any ordinary measure to assess the threat they represented. She was a wolf. She was fast and she was strong, and she had proved under real conditions that she could perform under pressure. Against the Volturi's guard, against centuries of immortal experience and accumulated power, those qualities might not be enough. She had made her peace with that, not with the idea of dying exactly. She was not serene about the possibility of dying, but with the fact that her presence on that field was not contingent on the guarantee of her survival. She was going to be there because this was her pack and this was their fight, and she was not the kind of person who calculated the personal cost before deciding whether to show up for the people she had chosen. She had established that about herself at the moment she stepped in front of a newborn to protect Seth, and the establishment held. The gathering in the meadow was unlike anything she had witnessed. The Cullens had assembled their witnesses over the preceding weeks, and the result was a collection of vampires representing the breadth of that world's diversity, beings from every geography and every tradition of immortal life, standing together in an alliance of mutual interest rather than shared affection. Leah moved through their periphery with the careful awareness of someone who understands that being a wolf in a field full of vampires, even vampires who are theoretically on the same side, requires a certain quality of attention. The vampires were controlled. They were here for a purpose, and they were maintaining the discipline that purpose required. But controlled and safe were not the same thing, and she did not conflate them. Seth was beside her. Jacob was close. The small pack moved as a unit through the larger gathering, occupying the space that was theirs within a configuration that had no real precedent. There was no tradition for this, no established protocol for wolves standing alongside vampires in a formal confrontation with the most powerful authority in the immortal world. They were improvising, all of them, working from first principles in a situation that had not been anticipated by any of the structures that usually govern their respective existences. The Volturi came from the north, emerging from the tree line in a formation that communicated everything about the power they believed they held. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who have been doing this together for a very long time, who have performed this particular kind of arrival enough times that it has become choreography, whose unity is not the improvised unity of the Cullen gathering, but the deep and practiced unity of an organization that has existed for millennia. They were in black, all of them, moving across the snow-covered meadow like a single dark current, and their number was considerable. The guard fanned out as they approached, positioning with the tactical awareness of warriors who did not need to consciously think about tactics, because tactics had long since become instinct. Leah assessed them with the objective part of her attention, the part that evaluated threat separate from emotion. They were formidable. Every one of them was formidable in ways that were visible even across the distance of the meadow. Something in their bearing that communicated capability without requiring demonstration. Aro detached from the formation as they came close, moving forward with the particular quality of someone who has never had cause to be uncertain about his welcome. He was smaller than she had expected, more contained, less obviously threatening in the way of someone whose power has never needed to announce itself physically because it has other means of expression entirely. He smiled, and the smile was the most unsettling thing about him. Genuine in its way, but genuine in the way of something that has long since moved past the ordinary human relationship to genuine feeling. The exchange began. Leah held her position and listened, which was all she could do, which was all anyone who was not Carlyle or Edward could do in this moment. The Cullens had prepared for this, had organized their evidence and their witnesses and their arguments with the careful thoroughness of people who understood that their only real weapon here was the truth, and who had therefore made the truth as legible as possible. Renesmee was presented. The witnesses were presented. The nature of what she was, half human and half immortal. Neither the forbidden immortal child, nor a threat that could be eliminated without addressing the fact of her humanity, was demonstrated through every means available to them. Leah watched Aro's face while this happened and tried to read it, and found she could not read it, which was information in itself. She had become accustomed to reading faces, to the particular skill of observation that came from spending time around people whose words and expressions did not always align. Aro's face gave her nothing. It was attentive and pleasant and entirely opaque, and behind it, something was processing with a calculation she could not access. The tension during this period was the kind that does not show on the surface. Everyone on the Cullen side of the meadow was still, controlled, performing the calm that the situation demanded, without having access to the actual calm it would have required. Leah could feel it in the pack mind, the sustained effort of Jacob and Seth holding themselves to the discipline the moment required, the awareness they all shared that a single wrong movement, a single misread signal, could change everything in ways that would not be reversible. She held herself to the same discipline. She did not move. She did not let what she was feeling in her body translate into anything visible. She was present and still and watching, and the watching was its own form of participation, its own contribution to the collective effort of making it through this moment, without it becoming the last moment for someone who did not need to die today. Then Alice arrived. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and total. Leah felt it before she fully understood its cause. Some change in the quality of the tension that indicated a variable had been introduced that no one had been accounting for. Alice and Jasper came from the edge of the trees, and Alice was bringing someone, evidence that the careful preparation of the preceding months had not anticipated, because Alice had not been present for the preparation, had removed herself for reasons that were now becoming clear. What Alice brought changed the calculation entirely. The evidence she carried addressed the question the Volturi had presented as their primary concern, demonstrated through living example what Renesmee's future looked like, provided the proof that the gathered witnesses and the careful arguments had been building toward but had not been able to fully supply. Aro received it, processed it. The pleasant opacity of his expression shifted into something that Leah could not fully read, but that the people around her, the people who knew him better or who could access more information than she could, responded to with a change in their own bearing. That was the first thing in this entire encounter that looked like relief. The withdrawal happened gradually, and then completely. The Volturi's formation, which had held its position with a rigid discipline of absolute certainty about its own authority, began to resolve, began to lose the precision of its arrangement. As the decision propagated through it, they were leaving. Not in defeat, not in the way of people who had been proven wrong, because the Volturi did not frame things in terms of being proven wrong. They were leaving in the way of people who have found that the situation does not require what they came prepared to provide, who are reframing the outcome in whatever terms allow their departure to be consistent with their own understanding of their authority. Leah did not care about the framing. She cared about the departure. She watched them go with the full attention of someone who has learned not to assume a threat, has resolved until it has fully and physically removed itself from range. She tracked them until they were gone from sight, until the tree line had absorbed them, until the meadow was occupied only by the people who had come to defend something rather than the people who had come to judge it. Then she allowed herself, quietly and without showing it, to exhale. The immediate aftermath was not celebration, though there were elements of relief that expressed themselves in ways adjacent to it. It was more like the particular quality of stillness that follows sustained intensity, the moment when the body and mind are still calibrated for emergency and are slowly receiving the information that the emergency has passed. People moved, spoke, touched each other in the careful ways of people confirming that those they care about are intact. The gathered witnesses began the process of departure, their role fulfilled, their various obligations to the color network discharged. Leah stood in the meadow after much of this had resolved, and looked at the churned snow where the Volturi had stood, and felt the full complexity of what she was left with. She was alive. Seth was alive. Jacob was whole. The people she had chosen to stand beside had survived the thing they had been surviving toward, had come through it with fewer losses than the situation had threatened to produce. These were not small things. She had been in enough genuinely dangerous situations by now to understand how not small they were. And the questions that had been deferred by the emergency were present again now, returning to their usual positions in her interior landscape with the patient persistence of things that cannot be resolved by waiting, but can only be sat with, until the person sitting with them is ready to look at them directly. She did not know if she would ever imprint. She did not know what the mechanism had in store for her, whether it intended anything for her at all, whether the question of her own imprint was something that would eventually answer itself, or something she would carry indefinitely into an open future. She had stopped wanting to know. The wanting to know had been its own form of suffering, the reaching toward a certainty that was not available, and she had learned over the preceding months that releasing the reach did not mean resigning herself to unhappiness. It meant simply being here, in the present configuration of her life, without requiring the future to declare itself in advance. She did not know if she would have children. That question remained open in the same way, carried not with the acute grief of the early months, but with the settled acknowledgement of someone who has accepted that certain things may not be knowable and has found a way to continue anyway. The suspension might be temporary. It might not be. The answer, if it came, would come when it came. bracing herself against the uncertainty, had not produced any information faster than the uncertainty itself would have. Her mother had Charlie now, quietly and genuinely, a companionship that had continued to develop through all the chaos of the preceding weeks, with the steady persistence of something that was going to last. Leah had come to a fuller peace with this than she had expected to reach. Harry was gone, and that loss was permanent and real, and she did not minimize it by calling it processed or resolved. But Sue was alive and choosing toward happiness, and the choosing was doing something genuinely good for her, and Leah loved her mother too completely to hold that against either of them. Seth was well. That remained the simplest and most sustaining fact in her life, the thing she returned to when the other things became heavy. Her brother was alive and intact and living his wolf life with the characteristic ease of someone who had never been given sufficient reason to be otherwise. She had protected him. She would continue to protect him. That was not a burden. That was one of the things she had found in the wreckage of everything she had lost that was genuinely and uncomplicated hers. She began to walk toward the tree line, away from the meadow and toward the forest, following the pull of the familiar ground. Jacob fell into step beside her for a moment, not saying anything, which was appropriate because nothing needed to be said. His presence communicated what it was meant to communicate. She received it without making anything of it beyond what it was, and what it was, she had finally allowed herself to understand, was enough. She phased when she reached the trees, feeling the familiar restructuring, the world expanding in her senses to the overwhelming richness of wolf perception. The forest was cold and dark and entirely itself, indifferent in the way of forest to the extraordinary things that had just happened in the meadow beyond its edge. She ran because running was what she did, because running required only herself and the ground and the movement forward. She did not know what came next. She had stopped requiring herself to know. She ran through the old growth trees of the Olympic Peninsula with the full extension of her speed, not from anything and not toward anything in particular, simply moving through the world she had been given with the strength of a body that had never stopped being extraordinary, even when she had been too grief-stricken to appreciate it. The cold air moved through her fur. The ground was solid beneath her paws. The pack mind held Seth's steady presence and Jacob's more complicated one. Both of them real, both of them here, both of them hers in the way that chosen family is yours. She ran, and the running was not flight, and it was not escape, and it was not the desperate forward motion of someone trying to outpace what was behind her. It was something simpler and more honest than any of those things. It was just Leah Clearwater, moving through the world at full speed, finally and irrevocably herself. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with ceremony or recognition. It does not produce the kind of story that gets told easily, the kind with a clear arc and a satisfying resolution and a moment you can point to and say, there, that is where everything changed for the better. It is quieter than that and more permanent than that, built not in a single moment of triumph, but in the accumulated weight of every ordinary day that was survived when surviving was the only option available. That is Leah Clearwater's strength. That is what she built, without intending to build anything. Through the years of carrying what she carried, she was the first. In all the generations of Kilut wolves, In all the centuries of the tribe's ancient covenant with the land and with the responsibility of protection that came with their lineage, no woman had ever become what Leah became. She did not choose to be first. She did not step forward for the honor of it, did not seek the distinction, did not want any part of what distinction required her to endure. She was simply the one in whom the old mechanism activated, the one whose particular combination of blood and grief and circumstance produced something unprecedented, and she carried the weight of that precedent without a map and without a predecessor, and without anyone who could tell her what came next. There is honor in that, even when it never felt like honor while she was living it. She lost Sam. She lost her human future. She lost her privacy to the pack mind and her certainty about her own body and the ordinary forward motion of a life that had once seemed so clear. She lost her father during the worst of it, when she had the least capacity to absorb the loss, and she absorbed it anyway because the alternative was not absorbing it, and she had never been someone who chose the alternative when the thing itself could be endured. She was shaped by every one of these losses in ways that were visible and ways that were not, and she came through them not unchanged. No one comes through that unchanged, but intact. Still herself. Still the sharpest and most honest version of the person she had always been, with more knowledge now of what that person was capable of surviving. She saved her brother. She stood in a meadow full of the most dangerous beings in the immortal world and did not flinch. She chose her pack, chose it deliberately and repeatedly, and the choosing was the thing that held when everything else was uncertain. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, between the grief and the fury and the long, exhausting work of continuing, she found something she had not expected to find. Not happiness, not in the simple sense, not the uncomplicated contentment of her life before everything broke. Something more durable than that. A self that had been tested and had not collapsed. A knowledge of her own resilience that could not be theoretical because it had been demonstrated under real conditions. A quiet and unshakable understanding that she was still here. She is still here. Somewhere on the Lapush reservation tonight, the ocean is pressing against the shore with its ancient and indifferent constancy, and the forest is dark and deep and full of the sounds that only she can hear. And Leah Clearwater is running through it as herself, completely and finally herself, the first female wolf in Quileute history, carrying everything she has lost and everything she has found with equal steadiness. She does not know what comes next. She has stopped requiring herself to know. So now, let her story settle around you, like the forest settles at the end of a long night, quiet and dark and full of something ancient and enduring. Let Leah's strength be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight, the reminder that surviving something is its own form of grace, that being still here after everything is enough. Rest now, breathe slowly, and let the sound of the ocean find you wherever you are, steady and constant and unchanging, just like her. Good night.